afternoon. I'd ask you to be seated. My name is Eric Sonquist, and I serve as the administrative officer that oversees the UCSB Economic Forecast Project. I'd like to welcome you here today. We're going to be talking about a report that's been developed by the Forecast Project with the support of the Hutton Parker Foundation, the Mosher Foundation. Ed, thank you for being here. The Gretler Foundation and Montecito Bank and Trust. This came about as a result of some conversations over the years about a study that was done in the late 90s or the early 2000s for about 5 years. Initially, it was a group of people that gathered with John Clark, who was at that time the executive director of the Community Environmental Council, CEC, and they produced a report that really looked at not just economic data, but social indicators, environmental indicators, and economic indicators as well, trying to measure the quality of life in a meaningful, consistent manner across time. As those conversations unfolded, it made sense to maybe to go back and revisit that format and to do it again. And with the support of our sponsors, we're able to do that and release it to the public at no cost to the public. So today is simply a walkthrough a little bit for Peter to talk a little bit about the project and what we've done, and for Tenny to talk about some specific data. We've also invited Bhupi Singh, who is the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer of Direct Relief, to talk a little bit about, as a large nonprofit operation in Santa Barbara, what they're seeing in terms of local needs and the programs that they focused on that are more local in nature. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dr. Peter Rupert, the director of the Forecast Project, to walk you through some of the data that he found most interesting.
Great, thank you, Eric. As Eric mentioned, we have two other people going to speak today. After me is Teniola Adadaji, who is a UCSB student. She worked in the Forecast Project last year as a sophomore. She's absolutely fantastic, and with students like her, the future is going to be fantastic, so we don't have to worry about the future. And Bhupi Singh will talk after that. I really appreciate Bhupi being here. Some of you may have heard there's some issues going on with hurricanes, and Direct Relief is into it. One of our alums, a friend of ours, works for Direct Relief. He's now on a cruise ship because no planes are flying in and out of Puerto Rico. He's on a cruise ship bringing people in and out of Puerto Rico. So it's a huge thing, and I really appreciate Bhupi being here because he's constantly busy right now. So anyway, this is what Eric said. We're going to bring this back after 14 years because there's lots going on in our community, and it's important, I believe, to do so. And so the first question that was asked to me is, what's a community? And obviously it's people. And what I mean by people is, it's about trusting and caring and health, belonging, all those kind of things. Shared responsibilities, shared experiences. And it's not really about a place or an organization. It's not a center. It's really just people. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on with people, what's going on. In order to do so, we really need, to better understand our people, who's coming in, who's going out, et cetera. And I have to say, we wouldn't have done this without our sponsor, so I really appreciate the Gretler Foundation, Hutton Parker. Tom Parker and I talked a lot about this, Montecito Bank and Trust, and the Mosher Foundation. So, that's who to thank. We just get our hands dirty and do the hard work, but they make it happen. So, here's the problem. The problem is people don't know the data. I'm going to call them ignorant, but I'm not calling them ignorant. I'm going to show you something. It's called the Ignorance Project, and it's done by a guy named Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling passed away just this last year. He's one of my favorite people. He was the head of health, the Department of Health, and a professor in Sweden. Fabulous guy. He really brought data to people. And Hans and his son started this thing called the Ignorance Project, and I'm going to stop it and give you guys a chance to answer. So.
I'm going to ask you 3 multiple choice questions. Use this device to answer. The first question is, how did the number of deaths per year from natural disaster, how does that change during the last century? Did it more than double? Did it remain about the same in the world as a whole, or did it decrease to less than half? Please answer, A, B, or C. I see lots of answers. This is much faster than I do it at universities. They are so slow. They keep thinking. Oh, very, very good. And we go to the next question. So how long did women 30 years old in the world go to school? 7 years, 5 years, or 3 years? A, B, or C? Please answer.
You should answer too in your own minds.
And we go to the next question. In the last 20 years, how did the percentage of people in the world who live in extreme poverty change? Extreme poverty, not having enough food for the day. Did it almost double? Did it remain more or less the same, or did it half? A, B, or C? Now, answers. You see, death from natural disasters in the world. You can see it from this graph here, from 1900 to 2000. In 1900, there was about 500,000 people who died every year from natural disaster. Floods, earthquake, volcanic eruption, whatever, droughts. And then, how did that change? We asked, Gapminder asked the public in Sweden. This is how they answered. The Swedish public answered like this. 50% thought it had doubled, 38% said it's more or less the same, 12% said it had halved. This is the best data from the disaster researchers. And it goes up and down, and it goes to the Second World War, and after that it starts to fall, and it keeps falling, and it's down to much less than a half. The world has been much, much more capable as the decades go by to protect people from this, So only 12% of the Swedes knew this. So I went to the zoo and I asked the chimps. Can you see it? The chimps doesn't watch the evening news. So the chimps, they just choose by random. So the Swedes answer worse than random. Now, how did you do? That's you. You were beaten by the chimps. But it was close. You were 3 times better than the Swedes, but that's not enough. You shouldn't compare yourself to Swedes, You must have higher ambitions in the world. Let's look at the next answer here. Women in school. Here you can see men went 8 years. How long did women go to school? Well, we asked the Swedes like this. And that gives you a hint, doesn't it? The right answer is probably the one where fewest Swedes pick, isn't it? Let's see. Here we come. Yes. Women have almost catched up. This is the US public. And this is you. Here you come. Ooh. Well, congratulations, you're twice as good as the Swedes, but you're not with me. So how come? I think it's like this, that everyone is aware of that there are countries and there are areas where girls have great difficulties. They are stopped when they go to school, and it's disgusting. But in the majority of the world, where most people in the world live, most countries, girls today go to school as long as boys, more or less. That doesn't mean that gender equity is achieved, not at all. They still are confronted to terrible limitations. But schooling is there in the world today. Now, we miss the majority. When you answer according to the worst places, and there you are right, but you miss the majority. What about poverty? Well, it's very clear that poverty here was almost halved. And in US, when we asked the public, only 5% got it right. And you? You almost made it to the chimp. That's little, just a few of you,
Okay, so you get the lesson that a lot of us, when we think about bad things, we think about some pockets And those pockets are places where things are really bad, but you have to think about the majority of the world. And the other thing Hans was doing before he died, he was a project to end poverty, which he said we can do. And that's part of the stuff about the community. Now, what we're going to do in the Community Indicators project, it's not going to be printed, it's going to be digital, and you'll be able to download it. It's going to be free to the public. We're going to update it as soon as new data come in, and hopefully you'll take a look at it. It's going to be, basically right now we have 3 sections, a social section, environmental, and economic. Part of the economics we do for the Economic Summit, so we're not going to spend a lot of time there. We have another book that does that. And each section contains how we're going to measure something in that particular section, why the data that we look at are important, and then how we're doing overall. So that's how the book is going to be laid out, and I'll explain a little bit about some of the graphs. So when we think about our community, there's close to 500,000 people now living in the county. The North County population has basically outpaced the South County population, as you can see. During the Great Recession, we got some increase in North County, but very, very small population increase until 2012 in South County, and then started to grow a little bit. And where are these people coming from? Who are the people now in our community? Well, as you can see, that going back to 2005, these are net domestic migration rates. So these are people coming in to Santa Barbara County from outside and people leaving. So this is the net. What you saw in 2005, 2006, 2007, we basically had almost no, and a lot of out-migration here, so people were leaving Santa Barbara County, and that happened until pretty much the end of the Great Recession. After the end of the Great Recession, we started to see a pickup, and every year since then, we've had positive in-migration, meaning our population's growing, more people are coming in now than are leaving. We can also find out using something called the American Community Survey, we know who's coming in. We know whether it's a foreign person coming in from another country or whether it's a domestic immigrant coming into Santa Barbara. We don't know where our immigrants, the persons leaving, go. We just know who's coming in. And what you can see, which is very interesting, this is an age distribution of movers back in 2015. What's very interesting here is, what really stands out is foreign immigrants into Santa Barbara County are pretty young, between 19 and 24. So we're getting a group of younger people coming into the county. And who's leaving? Well, 65 and over. They're leaving more than immigrants and foreign immigrants. If we look at the education distribution, again, this is something I think if I asked most people what you thought, and you answered honestly, it's not clear to me you would have said this picture. And what is this picture? This picture shows that foreign immigrants coming in have much higher post-college degrees than domestic immigrants coming into the county. So the people that are coming into our county are younger and more educated typically, which is something, as I said, I don't think most people would have thought about. They would think about, well, most people coming in maybe are working in the retail sector, working in ag, et cetera. It turns out the data doesn't support that. What you can also see is that people leaving, basically, compared to the immigrants coming in, people who leaving had less than high school degree. So again, it's one of these things that most people didn't really understand. This is really hard to see, sorry about that. I'm trying to get 2 of these on here. So this is the ethnic population diversity. This is the percent of individuals on the left is the South Coast, and on the right is North County. So what you see, Hispanic in North County, over 50%, close to 60% of the population is Hispanic in North County, and in the South County, just about half of that. And the rest are, pretty small in terms of population, some growing, some not. Educational attainment, and what you're going to get a picture of here is that basically the North County is much different than the South County, and we all know that. This is on the South Coast is on the left. To the far left is less than high school, some high school, some college. Here's a bachelor's degree here, the spike, master's degree, professional degree, and then a doctorate degree. And what you can see is that less than high school, 10% of the population in North County have less than a high school degree. In the South County, it's about 5%, a little over 5%. In terms of postgraduate, you can see that it's mostly in South County. So now that picture is, basically that there are more uneducated, less than educated individuals up in North County compared to South County. And that's one issue that we're going to work on. So the next component I'm going to talk about is working, earning, and living. So this is employment by industry. Again, this is some of the stuff we do in the summit. But what you can see is we're in a government building. So you can see that government has the highest population rate, fraction of population in the county. About 20%, it turns out, are government workers. The blue is 2010, and the darker purple is 2015. And so we've seen virtually, very small growth there. But where we have seen growth, this is trade, transportation, utilities. Over here, this is information. The information sector, which we all think of tech and high-level stuff, it's small. And we always talk about we want to increase the number of more educated, information technologies. But as of the moment, both information and financial services are pretty small financial activities, and there's been no growth at all in the financial activities sector between 2010 and 2015. What I mentioned before about information technology, these are real average salaries by industry. Again, the light blue is 2010, the darker purple is 2015. Information technology, their salaries went up a lot from 2010 to 2015, reaching up about 100,000 right now, relative to, say, in agriculture, which is 25,000, leisure and hospitality, less than 25,000, et cetera. So we know where the good jobs are. This is a household distribution of income. And what you see here is, now we're looking, again, we're going to split North County and South County, and we're going to compare that to California. So the light blue is California. If we look at less than 15 individual households that make less than 15,000, so there's compared to California, there's fewer households here that make less than 15,000. As we move to the right, you see that North County has more people, that's the red. North County has more people in these bins, 25 to 35, et cetera, until we get to 50 to 75. So what does this say? This basically says that roughly 50% of the individuals in North County make less than 75,000. That's roughly what this says. And as we move farther to the right, you can start to see the darker purple start to become the largest component. That being the largest component says there are roughly almost 10% of the population makes between 150 and 200,000 in South Coast, and closer to 5% in North. And then you can see it's the same going out farther and farther. And for all these to the right, we're higher than, the South Coast is higher than North County and higher than California as a whole. Again, saying that these are pretty, we are wealthier, making higher salaries in the South Coast relative to both North County and California as a whole. The problem there, as I mentioned, 50% of the population are making less than 75,000. This is housing affordability as of 2016, fourth quarter. What is this picture? So this picture basically says the following thing. Housing affordability is what fraction of people can afford the median house. That's what we mean by housing affordability. The US average, 58% of the population can afford the median house. In California, that number is 31%. Only 31% of the population can afford the median house. And Santa Barbara, well, we're not the most expensive, but only about 20% can afford the median house. And when you look back at this household income distribution, you can understand where the problem lies. The problem is that half the population, the median population, is making less than 75,000. This is why houses are expensive here, very difficult to live, obviously. Now a little bit about caring and investing in our community. So we're doing really well. What does this say? This says that contributions from nonprofits to our community have reached over $1 billion. That's incredible. So we're over $1 billion now. It's been, it fell during the Great Recession, and it's been rebounding ever since. I'm going to look now at a few different types of investments in our community. So this has to do with community. These are community relations. This is going to be to the arts and a few other things. And again, what you see is kind of low right after the Great Recession, and we've been building up. 2014, you can see is the highest. This is 60 million. And you can see where it's coming from. Almost all of it's coming from private. Very little is coming from government. Okay, so most of these contributions that we're getting into our community are private. Human services, so this has a much larger federal component to it. These are human services that go into helping the lower income, homeless, etc. So as you can see, we have kind of the same story. And the same story is 2014, the highest we've ever seen, and a larger fraction comes from government, but certainly a substantial part comes from private. These are environmental contributions. In terms of levels, they're a lot lower, but the same pattern arises. We're starting to see this pickup in contributions. And again, here the government not doing very much. Most of it's all private. Education. So this is money that goes into education, and Teniola got some, I think. Yeah, we got her some of it. But anyway, so she got a great fellowship. So again, you can see these contributions rising and rising. And a lot of this early stuff had to do with the Great Recession. I mean, people were less wealthy. Houses were worth less, etc. A little bit about the environment. So the environment I take kind of broadly. So there's many, many signs of improvement. Energy use has gone down. Air quality is much improved. Some people who are older here might remember that, you know, back in the 90s, it wasn't great here. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second. There's still some work to do. So this is electricity usage. So consumption of gigawatt hours. And you can see, even though the population has been rising, we had a couple upticks here, but now it's fallen. So energy use, you know, people are doing better. Solar, whatever it is, consuming less energy. This is toxins in the air. I'm not going to, these are, bad things. What can I say? In the air. This is the 90s. And you can see that this is where there was excess, above the guidelines. So, numbers like, 35, 25, 15, slowly gone down. And today it's 0. It's kind of incredible. I mean, you go to the Air Pollution Control District and they have nothing reported over that exceeds their guidelines. So it's pretty incredible. This is bacteria in the county beaches. I'm not even going to talk about this one because that's just disgusting. So, but it's down a lot, so that's really good. And you can see that, we've had this long, slow decline. So our beaches, even though population's up, things have been happening, they're better than they were many, many years ago. This is ozone exceedance days. Ozone exceedance days, back in the 90s, so they have this 1 hour standard, like how much ozone is going into the atmosphere during 1 hour and then 8 hours. And what you can see is during this 8 hour, it had 100 days that exceeded the guidelines back in the 90s. And we've been slowly getting better and better and better. And now you can see that there are very, very few days where we exceed the guidelines in terms of ozone. And I put the population here just because the population's bigger. There are more cars on the road. There's more stuff happening. Yet we've sort of figured out how to reduce that pollution in the air pollution. Some problems. Pesticide use is still pretty high. We had a big spike in 2012, and it really hasn't gone down. So even though many of us believe we're much more organic, we're not doing these things, it turns out that we've seen very, very little decline in pesticide use in Santa Barbara County. Why is that bad? It's bad because these are workplace pesticide illness and injuries. And there they've just gone up like crazy. So, people, the individuals working out in the fields, being close to these pesticides, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse since 2004. So that's one issue that we really have to start dealing with in the county. And yes, we do have the Christmas Audubon bird count. Don't forget that. There it is. You can pick out your favorite bird. Crows are doing well. Just so in case you did not. And however, the western meadowlark not doing so well. These things aren't unrelated, by the way, right? I mean, pesticide use, all kinds of stuff, fires, all these things lead to, less wildlife out there. And then you can see, the Nuttall's woodpecker, that's one of the ones they pick in the rent hit, kind of down a little bit. So if you want to volunteer this Christmas to the bird count, you should go out and you count birds. It's kind of fun. In terms of commuting and our environment around here, bus ridership is way down. Most people commute alone by car. Let's be more friendly. Pick up some friends. Everybody doesn't have to commute by themselves by car. This is ridership. This is bus ridership, down appreciably over the last few years. This is mean commute time. Mean commute time has very, very little change in mean commute time. And this is what I was saying. This is transportation to work. Of all the people that go to work, 67.1% drive in a car by themselves. Now, my guess is this is going to change over time. I think as we get things like self-driving cars, those kind of things, this is going to be a much better statistic. But 13.9, they carpool. I don't know why biking's not here. I bike to work, so it should be on here. Public transportation, pretty small. Health and safety. Again, positive signs all over the place, however, lots of negative ones. This is births to teenage mothers. Education, all kinds of things have brought that down, and it's gone down a lot. Right? Back in 2002, rate per 1,000 population about 50. We've cut that about in half. So that's a really, really good statistic. That means that these mothers can be staying in school, getting better educated, which is, as we'll see soon, an important feature. The property crime rate has not fallen very much. Just recently it's fallen a little bit. I've actually done a lot of work on the economics of crime, it turns out. And I have a paper that talks about crime. And since the 1970s and 80s, the crime rates all across the United States, including Santa Barbara, have fallen a lot. They've fallen almost in half. And by the way, it's all men that fell. Women's crime rates have gone up. They've gone up a lot. Equal opportunity. Let's not discriminate. They should be able to commit crimes too. I mean, come on. Back in 1970, basically there were no women committed motor vehicle theft, 0%. Today it's 15%. Not bad. Should get to 50, but we'll see. Anyway, property crime rates haven't fallen very much. The violent crime rate has fallen. In North County, it was pretty high, if we all remember this, back in 2008, 2009, 2010. It's fallen since then. South County has been falling pretty much all the time. This is pretty close to the rate in the United States, by the way. So we're not doing much better than the whole United States. We're doing a little bit better than California. And again, this stuff, there are pockets out there where it's really bad. I'm going to show you some in a second. This is domestic violence cases with a weapon. North County again in red. And you can see since 2008, there's been no decline in that in North County. Whereas in the South County, we're almost down to very, very low numbers. Lower than we've seen pretty much ever. So these weapon-related things, very, very, very low. By the way, I just triple-checked this today. I even told Travis. So I went to the Uniform Crime Reports, which is where you get the data from the FBI. All reporting agencies go to use the FBI to report crimes. And these are reported crimes. How many murders were there in the city of Santa Barbara in 2016? 0. Yeah. Anybody else would have guessed 0? I don't think so. How many in Chicago? As of today, this year, it's 700. Last year, it was 765. So violent crime, domestic with these cases with a weapon, down. Juvenile felony arrests, also way down in the county. So these are very, very positive signs for what's going on here in our community. The bad stuff, child maltreatment allegations. They've been going up and up and up every year. So we've got to start working more on, understanding what's happening to our children. Teniola is going to talk a little bit more about it when she talks. The other thing that looks bad, since 2012, basically 2013, we've seen a spike up in rape charges. So these crime rates are just have not declined at all in the county. So let me go back full circle now to the Ignorance Project. I mentioned Chicago. Chicago is synonymous with murder rates. I mentioned everybody kind of said, oh my God, yeah. It's not in the top 10 in the United States. Here's a picture of where, so this is St. Louis, they're the worst. These are 59 homicides per 100,000 people. Next, Baltimore, Detroit, New Orleans, Cleveland, Newark, Memphis. Here's Chicago, about 8th. So even though we hear just tons and tons about Chicago, it's what I mean. If I had asked everybody in this room who has the biggest crime rate, homicide, you would have said Chicago. Because it's in the news. By the way, it's in the news because there's really a lot of murders, but there's also a lot of people. So, I was just didn't say, don't move to St. Louis. You're going to get shot, so just don't do it. But what's Santa Barbara? Any guess where it would be? It's about 0.2 here. It's very, very low compared to, it's 2 per 100,000. So, it's a pretty small number compared to the rest of the world. Yet, we tend to focus on some of these really, really bad places. So some final thoughts. Community is very diverse. It's vibrant. We're growing. Incomes are going up. Employment's stable. We're attracting young and educated people moving into the county is what we want. Like anywhere else, there's lots of room for improvement. So now I'd like to turn it over to Teniola, and she's going to talk about the other parts of the book, which is about poverty and education. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction in the beginning and for the opportunity to be here today. I am beyond excited, and I am happy to be involved with this Community Indicators project and bringing it back from 2003, which was the last time we did it. Today I'm going to be presenting poverty and education in Santa Barbara County, but before we talk about Santa Barbara, I believe it's important to understand where we are globally. So in 2013, the World Bank reported that 767 million people fell underneath the International Poverty Guideline. This means that 1 out of 10 people were living off of $1.90 or less per day. However, for good news, this was down 1.7% compared to 2012, and in 2015, it was forecasted to be around above 700 million, which would be a 9% decrease from 2012, and shows that we're heading in a great direction. However, in 2015, the United Nations also completed their Millennium Development Goals, which has brought about the following changes in the past few years. The underfed population is cut almost in half, from 23.3% to 12.9%, as well as a decrease in maternal mortality rates and an increase in literacy rate between 18 to 24-year-olds. However, you might be thinking, what does this have to do with Santa Barbara? The reason that they've been able to make this tremendous change in the last 15 years is in 2000, they set out with 8 goals, and each goal had a specific target and a specific date in which they want to achieve it. With this, throughout the years, they constantly updated their initiatives and updated their programs to make sure that they're going to reach this benchmark in 2015. I believe that we should have this same behavior in our community when it comes to poverty and the education that we're giving to our children and our citizens. Whoops. I'm not sure where, not too sure where to point this. There you go. Awesome. Before we can consider battling poverty, it's important to understand what poverty is and how we measure it. The World Bank defines poverty as pronounced deprivation in well-being. There are 3 different ways you can measure this. The most common way to measure it is income. However, a better way to measure poverty is through specific consumption such as healthcare, shelter, and whether people are getting enough food. The reason that this is better is because income can be fluctuating, and even though someone has income, it may not actually be indicative to whether they can afford basic needs. This third way to define poverty is whether someone has the capability to function in society. This is a pretty broad view of poverty and not very easy to measure, so I'm going to be sticking to the first two definitions during this presentation. The key point is that measurement is key, and it's important that we continue to measure these statistics so we can identify and target areas in need and evaluate the effectiveness of our aid programs. So to move on to poverty in the county, this is a composition of families in the county at or above poverty or below. Over here, you can see that about 50% of the families in the county have children, although in order to be considered a family, you don't have to have children. A children is just two or more people that are related by birth, adoption, or marriage that live in the same housing unit. As you can see, 77% out of 2,081 households in the South Coast have children that are below the poverty line, and 83% out of 6,714 in the North County have children that are below the poverty line living in low-income communities. This is concerning because children that grow up in impoverished homes typically have an increased risk of lower cognitive abilities, lower school performance, and poor development. And this is a trend that we're going to see throughout the whole presentation, that there's a wide coverage of families in Santa Barbara County that are living in poverty with children that might be affecting their growth. These children often have parents that work. However, low wages and unstable employment oftentimes still has them struggling to meet their needs. In 2016, 15% of jobs paid less than the poverty guideline in Santa Barbara County. As you can see, there was a great amount of jobs that paid over 200% of the guideline. However, it's important to focus on the jobs that paid beneath because it's denying people the ability to afford their basic needs. People that are working 2,000 hours a year should be able to afford things like food, healthcare, and shelter. And so we've been trying to increase or decrease this percentage by doing things like increasing the minimum wage. However, the first increase didn't happen until January 1st, 2017, so it's hard to tell whether or not the statistic is going to go down through that, and it's something that we should keep an eye on. Even though raising people's income is certainly a good way to decrease poverty, it's more indicative to look at specific consumption such as healthcare. And the trend in healthcare in Santa Barbara County has been showing that the Healthcare for the Homeless program, which was created in 1988, has been going down since 2011. The number of users being served is now around 3,500. However, it's hard to tell whether it's because there's less homeless population needing to be served or whether less homeless people are taking advantage of the program. This is something that requires more research and an area that we need to look into because everyone deserves to have good health care in the community, and if less homeless people are taking advantage of the program, then we need to apply more resources. Although not every decline is good, here you see a graph of mothers receiving inadequate prenatal health care. The highest peak was in 2008 at around 30%, but since then it's been going down, and now at 2014 it's around 22.3%. Prenatal health care is important for mothers because if it's absent, then children have a higher risk of being born at a lower weight, and are 5 times more likely to die at birth. And so, although we've been declining and now we're at 22.3%, it's still higher than the state, which is 16.4%. And I believe this is a really important area in which we can focus on and get it down even lower than the state or even to single digits, because receiving prenatal health care is really indicative of successful births and the good future health of a child. Another indicator that's important for children is nutrition. The National School Lunch Program offers reduced or free lunches in public elementary schools, and you can use this as a map to show where the need is and the low-income families in the county. As you can see in North County, there is some variance between the different districts. In Ballard, the participation rate is close to 0%, whereas other districts such as Santa Maria and Guadalupe have close to 90% participation. This is showing us that North County in these areas need more resources and more help because their children living in low-income families that are relying on these school lunch programs in order to have proper nutrition. In South Coast, however, the districts have a lower participation rate, lower than the county and the state, the highest being Santa Barbara and Carpinteria at 50%, and the lowest being Cold Spring, which is nearly at 0. Another good indication of food security and whether people need assisted help in receiving proper nutrition is food banks. Food kitchens are usually used when people cannot afford food for themselves or their families. And in 2016, around 35% of the people served were under 18. Again, this is showing a huge trend that there's a lot of children living in low-income families that need this assistance and this support, and they're relying on food banks to help feed themselves. So far, so good, because we have been able to keep up with an increase of users in the food bank from 2015 to 2016. It was a 3% increase, and it's important that we keep on funneling resources to this program so other people are able to be fed. Educating the youth is another important indicator of the community health, and today, especially in the 21st century, it's important to be successful. They must be able to solve complex problems, collaborate, communicate, and learn independently. It's important to see in our standards that we're making the students have the move from concrete thinking to abstract thinking and how we're getting there. Here is a history of educational assessments, and as you can see, back in 1970s, we were really emphasizing low-level skills and minimum competency tests. We wanted students to be able to read, write, and do arithmetic, but it wasn't very focused on complex thinking. However, when No Child Left Behind was introduced in 2001, it increased the federal role in holding schools accountable, and schools became even more incentivized to teach to the test. Schools needed to teach to the test or they would be sanctioned, and some of the consequences included teachers being fired or schools being closed down. And so there was a really high importance on getting students to have high test scores, which is a really far away move from getting students to be able to critically think. However, in 2015, this act was replaced with Every Student Succeeds Act, moving this power back from the federal to the state governments and how the standards were going to be chosen and how they were going to be, the consequences were going to be picked. As you can see, the STAR exam replaced the CASSPP, which is the California Assessment of Student Performance and Progress in 2014. This test is supposed to test more critical skills analysis through interactive questions instead of multiple choice, where students can just learn through memorization. To show how we've been doing as a county in 2014 to 15, this is the scores for English grade 5. You can see that in South Coast, we've been doing fairly well. All the 6 districts are above the county and almost all are above the state. And there's not that much variation between the 6 districts. However, over in North County, there's a bigger problem because more than 5 fall below the county and the state, and there's a huge variation between the districts. Ballard has almost 90% percent of students that met or exceeded the standard, where Guadalupe has 10%. The fact that there's such huge variation between these districts shows that we could be doing more to move the resources or help these low-performing districts do better, since Ballard has the ability to do 90%. These other districts also have the ability to do 90%. And this shows an inequality of education happening in the system. These are the test scores for math, and it pretty much shows you the same story. As you can see, the entire county does significantly lower in math than English, but that's just a normal trend. Another benchmark that we use for seeing if students are prepared is the SAT scores. When you look at this graph, it's not really a pretty picture, and you might be thinking that students here are getting less intelligent, but this is a common trend that's been happening in the state as well as in the nation. The reasons for this, people think, is that there are more people that are taking the exam, people that never before ever thought about going to college, students that are from low income areas and don't get the proper amount of education. Another reason for this, people think, is that top students are moving to the ACT. In 2015, 1.9 million people took the test, which is a record for both the SAT and the ACT. And the third reason people think that for this decline is grade inflation. The Harvard Graduate School of Education did a test and found that as of now, the 47% of students get a grade A average on their report cards. And this has gone up significantly over the last few years. So it may be that students think that they're meeting standards, but in actuality, they might not be. It's important that we make a stress on education because the returns on education is huge. As you can see, this lower line, the blue line, is both men and women that have less than a high school education. The orange line is both men and women that have some college. The gray line is some college or associate degree, and the orange line is men or women that have a high school degree. The yellow line is men or women that have a bachelor's degree or higher, and there's a huge significant difference between the bottom line and the top line. The top line with bachelor's degrees or higher has been growing and increasing slightly, whereas the other three have been stagnant or even decreasing. And it's important that we prepare our students for a higher education and make sure that they're successful, because if we don't, then they're put at a disadvantage for the rest of their lives economically. In summary, children are the most important part of our community, and the trends are showing that a lot of them are living in low-income families where they might not be receiving the proper nutrition or health care. Especially when it comes to education, it plays an important role in keeping people out of poverty. As you saw in the last graph, there's a huge difference between people who finish high school and people who get their bachelor's degree. Education plays an important role in keeping people out of poverty, and then poverty also prevents people from getting the best education. And so it's important not only to increase income and increase wages, but also take a holistic approach and look at these specific stats such as healthcare and education and make sure that we're increasing across the board of the community. Thank you.
Am I there? There. I want to add a little context. These same issues related to education and poverty were present in '98 through 2003 as we did the study. And the disparities between the school districts is pretty profound. When we talked to the school districts, one of the things that they pointed out in the North County was that those districts that had the highest percent of migrant worker children and who attend less days per school had those results. So we looked at Blockman, Cuyama, Guadalupe. Those are all three school districts, two of them very small, with very large migrant populations as a percentage of their total student population. So we know there's other factors. It's not about good teaching or bad teaching, but it really is a highlight of where the issues are for us as a community. So Bupi, why don't you come forward and talk a little bit about direct relief, the big picture and the local picture.
Thank you, Eric. Again, when Peter, asked me to come and, speak for a little bit, and I was not sure what I was going to do, given this is a sort of an economic forecast project, and obviously everybody been seeing all these graphs. I unfortunately have got no graphs to show you, but I'll just keep talking and tell you about what we're doing and what's happening in our world. But I did, sort of think about the fact that, as a nonprofit, people sort of wonder what sort of economic impact nonprofits have in the economy. And I try to sort of understand a bit of that. It's sort of pretty impressive that actually from the sort of data of a couple of years ago, it was presumed that globally, if nonprofits were a country, it would be about the 16th largest economy in the world. So that's pretty astounding, to sort of consider at the end of the day, because we don't sort of, have that on top of our mind. And then try to understand, what about the U.S.? And you'll be surprised, the U.S. is actually a very large sector for the nonprofit economy. In the last time I could find some data was basically in 2012. It was about contributing 900 billion to the economy. That's about 6+% of GDP at that point in time. So I'm sure it's much higher now, but if you think about it, that's a pretty astounding figure. And then if you kind of look at, in terms of employment in the nonprofit industry itself, it's about close to 12 to 15 million people. And that's over 10% of the workforce. So that's again to show that it's a pretty healthy, and it's been growing year over year. And part of it, I think, also is driven by the fact that as government funding has shrunk, some of the gap has been filled by private philanthropy, by corporate philanthropy, and that's contributing to a very large part of some of this growth too. Coming to locally, I guess Peter will have sort of better information. The information I was able to get was a little bit old, in sort of dated about 2014 to 2013, and it was about $1.2 million. I mean, $1.2 billion. But my presumption is, coming into this year, we're probably going to be close to $2.5 billion, because interestingly, a direct relief alone is about $1 billion of that. Believe it or not, this year we just finished our June financial year, and our revenue was over $1.2 billion, and that was what we had brought in terms of both cash, products, and sort of contributions, and we have contributed out pretty much the aid we have provided around the world in over 80 countries. Ending in June was close to $1 billion. So it's a pretty large the percentage of the nonprofit activity in Santa Barbara itself. So obviously very healthy and sort of growing. One of the other statistics that was sort of interesting for Santa Barbara is that, I'm sure you guys all already know, but that we have almost twice the percentage of nonprofits per capita as compared to any other part of California. So that's, again, phenomenal, and they're just astounding in terms of the community input into this particular sector itself. Ed, I saw Ed, putting his head down, because obviously he's been in this for a long time, and he sort of appreciates the fact that how much community involvement there is in supporting the nonprofit activity in Santa Barbara. Now I'm going to go back to sort of go up to a little bit about direct relief. I'm sure most of you all know about its existence in here. It started in 1948, so we are close to a 70-year history in Santa Barbara. The last 10 years have been incredible growth for the organization. A lot of it, you all know, has been due to our CEO, Thomas Teig. Since he's joined Direct Relief almost 15 years ago, he's really led the organization with a very strong vision and strategy to focus and sort of almost make sure that we focus on the competencies of the organization relative to the great need for medical access and access to health around the world. As I mentioned earlier on, I mean, this year we're going to end up at close to 1.2 billion, and I'm sure if any of you has been by Hollister, you'll see this behemoth of a building that's coming up. That's going to be our new warehouse and new distribution center and new office. Especially as Peter mentioned earlier on, in times like this when we are responding to 5 emergencies all at the same time. These are 5 major emergencies with 3 hurricanes around the country, 2 major earthquakes in Mexico. It is sort of the time when you really realize why we need a building of the size that we need down in Hollister, because of the lack of space and the fact that the amount of product that comes in that needs to be turned around and shipped out, in a sort of a timely manner becomes very challenging when you just don't have space. So, we have about, currently about 75,000 square feet of space around the region. Thanks to UCSB, they have allowed us to, expand into some of their spare space, and even as early as this week on Monday, they allowed us to, use some additional space because we were just so slammed. So we have about 75,000 square feet of space, and we are now building a 155,000 square foot building, of which 130,000 will be dedicated, highly compliant, fully regulated pharmaceutical distribution center. It is exactly of the same level as any other commercial pharmaceutical distribution center, because at the end of the day, we have a very strong belief that you should not be distributing pharmaceuticals any less of a, in any less of a compliant and regulated fashion just because it's being distributed for free or it's for charity. A charity, should never be done at a standard any lower than any other person that's paying for it. So that's kind of a fundamental belief, and we've invested a lot in both technology as well as in capacity building, as well as in sort of systems, and in terms of headcount and people who are very, very well trained and focused on a high quality delivery of product. The one of the challenges that you sort of think about, especially when you look at these kinds of emergencies, that you always have to have enough capacity to sort of be able to swing up to the needs that you have. I mean, on a normal basis, you might be at about 60-70% of capacity, but when something like this happens, you very quickly get to close to 100% of our capacity. Right now we're at about 130% of capacity, so you can only imagine how we are managing all our products. To Peter, had sort of mentioned that it might be sort of interesting for you all to sort of understand how we are responding to what we are now facing with these 5 emergencies. It's very challenging because we only have a staff of about 75 people in Santa Barbara, and we talking of some massive amounts of destruction in Puerto Rico. In fact, unfortunately, I had to take a call just now and sort of step out because one of the CEOs of a company that is doing hemophilia medicine, sent me an email that they urgently needed to send for 70 patients in Puerto Rico who have been for the last a few days really badly in need of hemophilia medicine, which obviously is very critical because they need that factor to be able to survive. And so we're going to try to arrange for them to get it out tomorrow morning. So this is sort of interesting that we are always doing a lot of things on the fly, because when you have compromised supply chains, when you have compromised situations at the other end, it sort of behooves upon us to figure out what's the best way we can get something out there quickly. And we're very fortunate, of course, to be able to have some incredible the folks on the team that have been able to figure out what are the quickest way to get certain things to certain places. We have actually 2 people that are on the way to Puerto Rico right now. They were not able to get on any plane because they were not available for personnel. They were only available for major infrastructure type of things like generators and water, etc. So they are on a cruise ship that was willing to give them a berth free of charge. And they're going to be there tomorrow morning, and then they'll be able to assess the situation on the ground. It's very important for us to get people on the ground as quickly as possible, because it's, you can imagine in any sort of emergency, information is always compromised, information is always difficult to get, and lack of information prevents us from being able to do the right things in terms of making sure we get the right types of medicines, the right type of aid into these places. So it's very important for us to get people on the ground as quickly as possible. We have 2 folks that have just landed in Antigua in the islands, because the Caribbean islands have been pretty badly compromised, and once they've been there, they've been able to send us reports of what exactly is needed so that we can then ensure that we can get these things packaged and on a flight on FedEx the next day. We have FedEx shipments that go out every day to ensure the fact that we can keep a continuity of supply. And then Mexico, of course, hit us last Tuesday, which was totally unexpected, as you can imagine, because we cannot predict earthquakes. And that's another major situation, because we've got 6 particular regions in Mexico, south of Mexico City. Beyond Mexico, because we only see the pictures coming out from Mexico City, it's much worse below Mexico City when you go to Puebla, Morales, and Oaxaca. And there we have 3 members of our staff, including our CEO, Thomas Teig. He actually left on Sunday night because we have been asked, believe it or not, by the government of Mexico to basically coordinate all of the health, the medical distribution to these particular regions. And we only had a staff of 2 starting last week, so we are being expected to scale up over a few days, which is, again, something that we've got a very strong team that's able to figure out how best to scale up. So as far as these sort of major emergencies around the world are concerned, those things that happen episodically. However, that's not what we do every day. So you might wonder, what do we do for the rest of the time? Actually, we have got a very strong program that has got a continual delivery of aid on an ongoing basis to about 75 countries around the world and about 4,000 facilities in the United States. So many folks don't know that the U.S. is, for us as a country, is probably the largest recipient of aid from direct relief. All of that aid goes to the community health centers that basically cater to the uninsured and the underinsured population of the country. That's about close to 25 to 30 million people go to these particular clinics. That's their medical home. And we started this work back after Katrina and Rita, when we realized that there were some compromised situations of health access for the folks that were impacted by those particular hurricanes. And then that made us sort of realize that there's a bigger problem across the United States. And since then, the program has grown. So, currently we have close to $150 to $200 million of aid going out a year to these clinics, where, it serves almost close to 23 million, people on an ongoing basis. And beyond that, if you come down to the community level itself, our own county itself, the direct relief has been very active, one in obviously supporting the community health clinics here, our neighborhood clinics. They've been recipients of our donations, both in terms of medical product donations as well as cash grants to help them in their operating activities itself. We've also been very much involved with the Doctors Without Walls, whereby we have been able to equip them with medical emergency packs. We've actually equipped all the medical reserve corps in the county, going all the way down to Ventura, with first responder medical packs that have got all the materials that any one particular first responder will need, any kind of emergency. It was interesting when President Bush created the Medical Reserve Corps after 9/11. The Corps was created to basically ensure the fact that there will be volunteers in any particular emergency that might happen in any community, but it was never funded, very similar to what most government stuff happens. And so we sort of realized that while these folks have been charged with responsibilities, they actually don't have any materials. And they will easily either just buy their own materials, or they steal them from the hospitals they work at. So we decided to create this Medical Reserve Corps pack that's actually certified by the California Emergency Medical Systems, so that folks can have something that they can actually use. So a whole county has been outfitted with that. We also, interestingly, not many people know that, are the location where the South County's medical cash is stored by Santa Barbara County. And again, because from our point of view, we live in the community too, so if there's any sort of emergency in the community, that medical cash can be accessed by the emergency medical services of the county and be used in wherever it needs to be used. And we're hoping to expand that as we go into a new building. Currently being so tight, we've only been able to spare them about, just less than 5,000 square feet, but we're expecting to have a much bigger space locally for stockpiling emergency medicines and emergency supplies. And so really, in a way, we are sort of part of the support system for the local community in the event emergency. We hope it never happens, but we always got to be prepared. So we feel that there's a lot more we can do in the local community, and with the new building we'll have the capacity to do that. We'll have obviously the systems and the compliance and the regulatory situation that we need to have to be able to respond in any kind of a local emergency. Well, just to kind of give you a background, sorry, I wasn't prepared as much as we was. We just been very strapped back in the office, but we look forward to working with the community locally to do as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Bippy. So Peter mentioned early on, we're going to be distributing this electronically. You'll be able to find it on our website at the university. But Steve Ortiz and his team from United Way will be helping us with the distribution. So the Santa Barbara Foundation will be distributing out through their mailing lists and communicating out to folks. The whole idea is to put all of the data out in the community for discussion. It's not a policy document. It doesn't give recommendations. It gives you data. And that really is the intent of the project. So I'd like to entertain some questions if we have them. Do you have any questions out there about what you've seen or heard today of the speakers? Anybody you'd like to ask a question of? Going once. Yes.
We're very impressed with direct relief. We're all very proud to have you as part of our community. This is a strange question, I know, but given the exodus of a lot of companies out of California, can you just address why you do choose to stay here and expand and collaborate with the UCSB, et cetera?
Yeah, that was sort of an interesting question that we were faced with even 4 or 5 years ago. When we were first started thinking about building a new building, one of the questions that came up was, why do you stay here in Santa Barbara? I mean, one is the history. We've been here, at that time was 67 years, and we felt history is a very important part of the psyche of any organization, and from our perspective, that was very key. Number two, we've got a very strong, stable, set of supporters in Santa Barbara itself. We've got a very strong community that values direct relief in what it does, both locally in the United States as well as around the world. And number three, we actually got an incredible set of employees that work at direct relief, that if we were to move out of here, we obviously will lose, most of them. I presume they still enjoy the weather and the surfing around here. But it's a people that makes the organization at the end of the day, and for us that was important. There was a lot of questions from the community as to why would you build a warehouse here when you could build it in South LA or somewhere else where the land is cheaper. So for us, the difference in amount of what we would have saved by building something somewhere else could not be, compensated for the employees that we have here and the support of the community, and the fact that we were born here and we want to stay here.
Are there other questions? Yes, Lee.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Economic Forecast, for the indicators. Eric and I were privileged to work with John Clark and Brian Cardell and Bob Wilkinson and some other great people when the first indicators thing happened. It's hard to believe it's almost 20 years ago now. And when that wound down, there were a lot of debriefs about what had worked and what hadn't. And so my question is, many people feel the Achilles heel of the indicators the first time around, and something that contributed to loss of community interest and funding was most companies and institutions and nonprofits are looking at outcome-based funding. And people would say, this is a very interesting report. Where is it going, or what does it mean? And we told them by prior agreement, very similar to what Eric has said now, these are just the facts. It's up to the community to decide what to do with them. And as a result of that, each report got less and less press and less funding and less audience, and very little specific reform came from them. How is this new similar initiative hoping to avoid that outcome?
I get to answer this one. So Lee's right. That was one of the issues that was raised at the time. I think there's two things. The first thing, and I think Peter alluded to it, is the relevancy of the data. And the technology really is there now to put this report up and update it with new data as new data comes in. I think that's a really big difference. It doesn't change the political process in this community, and I don't think that's our role even still. So I would acknowledge there is an issue there, but the question is, what's the right bridge, the right place for those discussions to happen? I think the other part of the puzzle is how you disseminate it to the public. We were really pretty much restricted to hard copy and whoever showed up in this room when we did our releases. And with the help of United Way and the help of the Santa Barbara Foundation, as well as our own Economic Forecast Project sponsors, and many of them are in the room today, our board members as well, thank you for being here. We know that we can send stuff out in a very different way and penetrate the community in a much broader way in terms of giving folks information. I think that's something that, as Peter started with the issue of ignorance, there's an importance to understanding what the data, what we have. And really, what we've shown today is a small sample of what we've got in the book and what we hope to continue updating. The incremental cost of updating is much less than building it in the first place. And we really, because it was, 15 years ago, we had to start from scratch. We had a couple of great graduate students who really did the vast majority of the work and were funded by our sponsors for the project this time around. But my hope is, by regularly disseminating it and reminding folks of it through our community partners, as opposed to just thinking we're going to do it on our own, it has a very different profile. I know when Steve and his team from United Way go out to communicate to their donors and their clients and the organizations they work with, and they say, hey, go check this out, new data on X. If I'm a partner to United Way and I do part of my fundraising as a nonprofit, that's an important cue for me. The same is true with the Santa Barbara Foundation, which has got tremendous outreach, not just in the South County. Both these entities have very large North County presence. And the one thing that I think we're changing that's significant, the original was the South Coast Community Project, Indicators Project. It was really just south of the mountains. We are building comparable data for the North County. And actually, Tom Parker's impetus in bringing the subject up actually came out of those original studies. One of the things that he realized was there was a singular lack of nonprofit support in the county, the parts of the county that maybe needed the most. And he went up and acquired the old Coca-Cola plant up in Santa Maria, converted it to a nonprofit center, which is low rent, good quality, great location facility for nonprofits that work in Santa Maria. It changes your operating budget. Your bottom line changes. You can leverage more to program because you're not paying rent. And I think we've seen that in the South County. You just got to go right up State Street to the old Wells Fargo building, which is now the Performing Arts nonprofit center. So I think there are outcomes. They may not be the ones that pitch big wave news press coverage, but they're significant. I think as we do the North County, that will be really a big change. So I'll hand it to Peter. He has some other comments on this.
So Lee, thanks. Great question. I'm kind of an output-based person. I like to see what happens. I want to see when money comes in, where it goes, and outcomes. And I've talked to Boopy about this before, and Thomas at Direct Relief. How do you know you're achieving what you want to achieve? So that's important. But I want to step back. I'm actually going to step back now. So I worked at the Cleveland Fed for a long time, and I was doing something for the president there, and she asked me to write a speech for her on education outcomes. I'm a labor economist, and so I found the best data I could, which came from the Manhattan Institute, an economist I really liked. And what he did was he said, let's measure high school graduation rates. And he measured them. He looked at the 50 largest school districts in the United States, and he ranked them, graduation rates. What was the lowest? I just told you, I was in Cleveland. Turns out it was Cleveland. What number? 28%. was the high school graduation rate. The highest was in Fairfax County, Virginia, 98%. So anyway, I presented this, I wrote up the speech, I give it to her, we have all the data. She goes, I can't say this because the superintendent's a friend of mine. And I said, come on, the data's, we got to talk about this. She refused to put it out, and so she allowed me, however, to have a conference. So we had a conference on education, and we brought in a whole bunch of different people, someone from Chicago, Denver, Stanford, Hoover, etc. And we got some results. Let me tell you what happened. The guy in Chicago said, here's the problem in Chicago. All the poor kids, they live with 3 different families on average per year. And they have to go to different schools, and they're always behind. So we got together. No politicians were involved in this part. We got together. What's the solution to that? The solution is we talked to the bus company in Chicago, and they said, any poor kid who needs to go to the same school, we'll bus them free to the school. Okay? So that's number one. So no political support. It was just the bus company giving free rides. But that came from us understanding the data where the problems were. The second thing that happened was the person from Denver started the pay for performance program in Denver school district because the Denver school district was hurting, and they said we got to try something new. So they got rid of unions. Well, they argued, but so look, I agree on the output measures, and I think we can do something. First, we have to know the data. Once we know the data, we can say, okay, now we can work on this, and then we can work on it and get some output measures, which I want to report on. I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. I mean, I'd like to, but I'm not going to. But and get those output measures. I think it's important.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I'd like to return.
Wait a second. I want to talk in the mic.
Okay, great. I want to return to the nonprofit sector, which I call the third economy, which is always terribly underreported in the economy. It's there when the economy collapses, All these organizations step up to help the economic bloodbath and try to stabilize communities. I just saw recently the local reserve in St. Louis is actually turning to nonprofits to build local food economies and really pouring money in there. And I just read recently that the Fed up in San Francisco is focused at that, looking at that as a way to rebuild local economies and keep local jobs. And these are driven by nonprofits. We're very involved with policy. We really are. The changes, like what's going to happen in the future, directions for the government, jobs, job training, all these things that create a new economy, yet you wouldn't realize it when you look at the economic figure. It's all like the economy is producing this, yet we have such a strong nonprofit economy here that really steps in, the solar, everything else you can look at, what changes in the jobs. It comes mainly out of the nonprofit world and then goes to the profit world.
So, you have a question of us?
Oh, okay. I would just like to see more focus on that energy, okay? Sorry.
No, that's okay.
So one of the reasons we brought the Community Indicators Project back was I was with Tom Parker, and he said, we should bring this back, but he really wants to focus a lot more on the nonprofit sector, to which I agreed. And so there's going to be a whole section on nonprofits, and we're going to start really looking at that more carefully, what they do, how they do it, the impact in the economy. So that's an important part of this, and you're right, and thanks for saying that.
I just want to know, was there anything in the data that surprised you? Because looking at these are trends that you've talked about a long time that I think people have looked at. So is there anything that you thought was surprising?
Ask Penny.
Well, for me, I thought the most surprising one was the last graph with the SAT scores on the decline, because as technology is more advanced, you have things like Khan Academy, and people are learning online, and information is so much more available that you would think that SAT scores are going up and people are able to take these tests more easily, but it was just like a straight decline, and that was really surprising for me.
Yeah, to me, so it was some of the crime statistics. I thought we'd done much better on crime on the decline. Because if you look in the U.S. as a whole, property crime has really fallen a lot over the last 20 years or so, and we've just pretty much maintained it. I had thought it would be much smaller than that. But 0 murders also surprised me in Santa Barbara City. But okay, well, I want to thank everybody for coming, and you'll see the Communicator's Project coming out soon.